Admiral Kirby, thanks for your time. I'm so grateful you could join us for the conversation.
I'm glad to be with you. Thank you so much for having me.
So I want to start with a really difficult question for you. Many millions of people around the world watch your briefings, world leaders, the president, but I understand you have two very tough critics at home. Is it true that your mother and your wife both watch your briefings? Tell me about their critiques. What's their feedback like?
Yeah, I mean, every single time I get a text or two from each of them after a briefing, or it could be a TV appearance. And they can be pretty rough on me. It's maybe they count how many times I say or the tie I'm wearing or the suit I've chosen. But mainly it's how clear I have been or not. And if I, for instance, my wife does not like me being too colloquial. I grew up in Florida, and sometimes I talk about alligators and snakes and that kind of thing. And to make my point, she doesn't like that at all. My mother gets on me, particularly when I'm talking about sensitive foreign policy issues like Russia, Ukraine, China, Taiwan. If I don't make it simple and clear enough, she likes my sentences shorter, my words smaller, my thoughts a little bit more crisp. And so each of them come at me a different way, but it can be pretty tough.
Well, I was going to say that sounds pretty productive. Actually, that's pretty good feedback. That's some of the same feedback I gave to reporters at CBS, which is explain it for the people at home. Right?
Yeah.
Break things down.
Yeah. Abraham Lincoln used to say, don't be a speaker, be a talker. And I try to remember that, especially when I'm at the podium. And I know it's going to sound hokey, but it's true. When I'm up there and I'm getting questions from the press, I try to pretend like it's my mother asking me that question, not, say, Jeff Mason of Reuters or Peter Doocy of Fox News. And I figure if I can give the answer the way I would give it to her, then two things will happen, hopefully. One, it'll be more clear and precise, and I'll do a better job for the president. And two, I won't get such nasty texts after the briefing is over.
At least not from home.
Right.
So I want to hit a number of topics that have been in the headlines, something you've been addressing from the podium for a couple months now. We're now in the 11th week of the war in the Middle East between Israel and Hamas. And I want to start this interview with the end, as in, how does this war end? How much pressure right now is the U.S. putting on the Israelis to wrap this up? And how close does the U.S. believe Israel is to achieving its goals? Is it a matter of weeks, months, or could it be longer?
There's an awful lot in there, so I'll try to unpack it as briefly as I can. The Israelis have already talked about the fact that this could take some months. They have been saying that since the beginning. They reiterated that last week. And today, with our Secretary of Defense in Tel Aviv, the defense minister of Israel said basically the same thing. We have to take them at their word. They're the ones on the ground. They're the ones in this fight. And what we want to do is make sure that they know we'll support them for as long as that fight is valid. And then you ask, like, how does this end? I don't think we here in the United States or in Washington know the answer to that specifically. What we do know is what can't continue is Hamas in control of Gaza. What can't continue is such a viable, violent, vicious threat in Gaza presented to the Israeli people and to the Israeli nation. So we know that at the very least has to be an outcome here. Now, when exactly it ends and how it ends, again, that's really going to be for the Israelis to decide. I will tell you that we still don't support what people are calling or referring to as a general ceasefire, a permanent ceasefire. It's not that we want more violence and more war. The war could end today if Hamas would do the right thing and surrender all the hostages, surrender all those responsible for October 7th and lay down their arms. It could end today. But the reason we don't support a general ceasefire at this time is that it would basically leave Hamas in control of Gaza. And that is a condition that we just can't support. It would also validate what they did on the 7th of October. Basically say, well, it's okay that you killed 1,200 people and took a couple of hundred more hostage. We'll sit across the table with you as a negotiating partner. This is not a group, an organization that you can trust as a negotiating partner for some sort of long-term peace and stability. Now, what we do support are humanitarian pauses, short-term, more localized pauses to see if we can get hostages out and more aid in. Over the course of that 1 week, we got 100 hostages out, got an increase of aid in. That was all good. And then Hamas pulled the plug on that. They weren't willing to release any more women and children. So we're back at it hour by hour to see if we can get them back at the table for that.
Is the elimination, though, of Hamas a realistic goal at this juncture? And I ask that in light of the fact that, we've, as Americans, we've watched what took place with the Taliban in Afghanistan. Of course, these are imperfect comparisons, or the evolution of the insurgency into ISIS in Iraq and Syria, which, you've been managing, you've been working on for decades here. And we're seeing the rise in popularity of Hamas in the West Bank. We saw those green flags being waved as the Palestinian prisoners came home. So is it really realistic here to say there will be no Hamas in this post-war reality?
It is certainly realistic from a military perspective to believe that you can decapitate that network, that you can cut off its leadership, cut off its resourcing, cut off its ability to train and plan and execute attacks. We proved that with ISIS. We still have a small number of troops in Iraq and Syria. In Syria, they're mostly advisors, and in the same in Iraq. ISIS is nowhere near what it was back in 2014. It's still a viable threat, but it doesn't have a caliphate anymore. It's having a hard time just maintaining its own ability to continue to exist as an organization. The same could be said for Al Qaeda. So going after the leadership, which Israel is doing, is a viable and can be a very valuable military tactic and approach to do this. Now, that doesn't mean you're going to eliminate the idea of Hamas or the ideology that they propose and that they offer to people that are sympathetic to their views. And I think our Israeli counterparts understand that. But what we do believe is a possibility here and a goal worth pursuing is getting Gaza not to be governed by Hamas. Now, are you going to get rid of every fighter? Probably not. You're not going to kill the ideology, but you can eliminate and terminate their ability to govern in Gaza.
And that's despite the fact that you even have folks within the Palestinian Authority, which is the main group it appears the U.S. is looking to put in charge there, saying, like, listen, they might be a junior partner. Like, we find it very difficult to confront a reality where Hamas, after more than a decade of ruling Gaza, is going to have zero role in it.
Well, we believe the Palestinian Authority also, needs to be revamped. It needs to be revitalized so that it can be more credible and more authentic in the eyes of the Palestinian people. We know that Hamas does not represent or speak for the vast majority of the Palestinian people, particularly those in Gaza, and particularly now in the wake of this conflict and the suffering that Hamas has caused on them. There was a ceasefire, remember, on the 6th of October. Hamas chose to violate that ceasefire. Hamas chose to put the people of Gaza at greater risk. And so what governance looks like in Gaza going forward, we can't say definitively. Nobody knows the answer to that. But we do believe it has to start with a revitalized Palestinian Authority that can be seen as authentic and credible in the eyes of the Palestinian people, and that can with regional support develop the structures and the institutions and the credibility to govern in Gaza. Now, again, what role would a Hamas of the future look like in that? We don't know. Again, what we do know is Hamas can't stay independently in control of Gaza the way they have been.
So the humanitarian situation now, the UN has expressed concern about the people trapped there without basic infrastructure. It's something the U.S. is concerned about as well, the spread of disease. Given the percentage of Palestinians displaced here, how much pressure is the U.S. applying right now on neighboring countries like Egypt to potentially take in refugees like women and children? And I say that in light of the fact that we saw Europe take in millions of Ukrainian refugees. We've seen surrounding South American, Central American countries take in millions of Venezuelan refugees. We haven't seen that in the Middle East. Is the U.S. pushing neighboring countries to do that?
What we're doing is working with partners in the region to see if we can get more aid and assistance into Gaza, and so that we can alleviate the suffering. And just today, based on our urging of the Israelis, the Israelis opened up Kerem Shalom, which is just a few miles away from the Rafah crossing in Israel. And so between Kerem Shalom today and Rafah, almost 200 trucks got in. Actually, just about 200 trucks got in, which is a really good option now. We have another way of getting aid and assistance in. Obviously, we're doing everything we can to support the UN relief effort inside Gaza. But many people in Gaza don't want to leave. It's their home, and they're worried that if they do leave, they might not ever be able to get back in. We do not support any kind of forced displacement of the people of Gaza outside Gaza. And that's one of the reasons, because we know that, that they're worried that if they ever were to leave, that, they wouldn't be able to get back in. So what we're trying to do is work with partners in the region to get more aid and assistance in, provide more opportunities for medicine, for fuel, for food, for water, so that the people in Gaza can get the care that they need, as well as, and this is not an unimportant point, working with our Israeli counterparts to be more precise, more careful, more deliberate in their targeting, so that as all this aid gets in, and as temporary lodging is set up, temporary facilities are set up for the people that have been internally displaced, and there's been more than 1 million that have been internally displaced, that they don't have to worry getting from A to B to get to that aid station, that they're going to get targeted, and that while they're at that aid station for however long they are, that they can be safe and secure there. So that's really what our focus is.
So it's the U.S. Understanding that through enough aid into Gaza, you can alleviate these issues, that basically it's possible to deal with a displaced population, upwards of 80% of Palestinians for potentially years, right, given the destruction of the infrastructure there, that's all possible within Gaza.
We believe if we work close and hard with our regional partners and with the UN, that we can go a long way to alleviating some of this suffering and to ensuring better safety and security measures for the people of Gaza. And again, we understand that many of them don't want to leave because they're afraid that they won't be able to get back in.
So you mentioned Secretary Austin is there as we speak. One thing that struck me, he said recently, was that the Israelis could achieve a tactical victory but strategic defeat in terms of how they pursue this war. Can you explain that concern, especially in light of maybe lessons we've learned as Americans in the wars we've pursued in the region in the past couple decades?
And that's where he's coming from, his experience in Iraq and Afghanistan, fighting insurgencies, fighting terrorist groups, that if you're not mindful of the hearts and minds of innocent civilians that are caught in the crossfire, if you're not mindful of their needs, if you're not respectful of getting them the assistance they need, if you're not being careful in how you go after the bad guys, you could turn what would be a tactical victory, say an airstrike or two that killed X number of terrorists, but you might create more harm and more suffering longer term if you're not careful about what you're doing to civilians. And in fact, perhaps even inspiring younger generations through anger and rage to join Hamas or to join terrorist organizations. That's what he's talking about. This is something we learned through bitter experience in Iraq and Afghanistan, when we weren't as targeted, we weren't as precise, when we weren't as focused on the civilian populations in both countries. We ended up in some cases turning one-time friends into future enemies.
Are you concerned the Israelis have done that in the first couple of months of the war here in Gaza?
We know that they're receptive to that message, and Secretary Austin talked a little bit about that today. They're receptive to the message about a strategic defeat here if they're not more careful and more precise, and they have taken steps. That doesn't mean that more can't be done. More can be done. We don't want to see any more civilian casualties. The right number is 0, but they have taken some steps to be more precise and more targeted, going in more on the ground. When you're on the ground with troops up against these targets, you can be a little bit more precise and surgical in how you're approaching that target than if you're just dropping a bomb from the air. So when they went into North Gaza, for instance, they went in with a smaller amount of force than they had originally planned. When they started to shift to the south, they published maps online and dropped leaflets telling people where they could go to be safe or not. That's basically telegraphing your punch to a potential enemy there.
Is that something the U.S. did? Did the U.S. ever do that in Iraq or Afghanistan?
I don't recall a time when we ever telegraphed our punches that way, where we dropped leaflets and maps and said, here's a safe place, here's not a safe place. But then again, we also had some precision capabilities militarily that not every military has out there. So they are making efforts again, but I don't want to, I'm not trying to sugarcoat it or our message to them, which Secretary Austin delivered again today. There's more that can be done. There's more that should be done because the civilian casualties continue to happen, and obviously we just don't want to see that.
Some notable poll numbers are out in the U.S. that shows a generational divide in views of this war. And certainly, the U.S. has seen its share of criticism domestically, abroad from allies, as well as from adversaries, folks in the region, etc. As a communications expert, curious as to whether you think the U.S. government is effectively communicating foreign policy priorities. The Biden administration is communicating foreign policy priorities, especially to this younger generation of Americans. What do you think explains the divide?
I'm not a pollster, and I wouldn't presume to think be able to speak for public opinion across the country. I would tell you that as a communicator, you got to approach every challenge like this with a sense of humility, and you have to realize that just because you're putting something out there doesn't mean it's being received in the way that you want it to be. The most important part of communicating is listening. And the greatest myth of communicating is that you've actually done it. And so we've got to make every effort and take advantage of every tool to communicate our message and what we're doing and why we're doing it to as many audiences as possible, understanding, in fact, maybe especially because certain audiences are struggling to understand or to come around to supporting what we're trying to do. So, I mean, I think we're approaching this again with a sense of humility and trying to do the best we can to make it clear what we're doing and why and what the context is behind these decisions. I mean, what happened on the 7th of October should not be forgotten. 1,200 people innocently slaughtered. Kids in front of their parents in front of their kids, some 200 hostages taken. And again, for all those calling for a ceasefire, I would remind them there was a ceasefire on the 6th of October that Hamas chose to break. And so you gotta keep articulating it.
I read a post you did a few years back, the 13 rules, Kirby's 13 rules. And I was struck by a couple of them. One, rule number 2, always be skeptical. It's something you said you've applied in your line of work. You question policies, etc. Has that applied in this war? And can you elaborate?
I would say the president has a terrific team on the national security front. And that starts with the vice president right on down to everybody in the National Security Council that are wrapped up in this particular conflict. And he welcomes opposing opinions. He welcomes his assumptions being challenged. He wants us to wring every problem out and look at it from every possible side as he decides where he's going to go on the policy. And it starts with him from a very principled position about our unshakable alliance and support for Israel and their right to exist as a nation. It also starts from a very high principle of the need to respect the law of war and to avoid civilian casualties and to cause as minimal harm as you can to civilian infrastructure. Those two things are not in they're not in contravention with one another. They are mutually supportive. You can do both, and that's again how we've approached this with Israel from the beginning. But yes, I mean, all of us every day when we get up and we read the news and we have our conversations with our counterparts, we're looking at this with a sharp eye, and we're asking tough questions, not just of ourselves, but of our Israeli counterparts. Jake Sullivan was just in the region a few days ago. Now you have Secretary Austin there. Secretary Blinken's been there 3 times. And I can promise you, each and every one of those meetings comes from a place of asking our Israeli counterparts the tough questions. Have you thought about X? Why aren't you doing Y? Here's the lesson we learned in Iraq and Syria. You should think about applying that. So it's not just asking ourselves and being skeptical of our own assumptions, but asking our counterparts those tough questions too.
How unique is that relationship the U.S. has with Israel? How the conversations you describe between us and the Israelis? How many other countries in the world do we talk to like that? Do we have a relationship with like that?
Well, you know, it's because you're friends that you can have those kinds of candid, tough conversations. I would tell you, we have those kinds of candid, forthright conversations with Ukraine, asking them those tough questions, you know, about their counteroffensive and what their plan was and what their thought was for the timing and for the strategy and for what the capabilities that they thought they were going to need. I mean, you can have those conversations with a friend and an ally in many ways more than you can with somebody who you're not a friend and an ally with. But it's not uncommon for us to do that.
You brought up Ukraine. Want to ask about that real briefly. Nearly 2 years in now. The counteroffensive this year, not as successful as some had hoped, in some cases gaining yards day by day. Putin said last week that this isn't ending anytime soon as far as he's concerned. What is the realistic end game for war in Ukraine? Especially, I hear from a bunch of Americans who are like, listen, we've given them $100+ billion. Like, at what point does this end, given what we've seen? Will the Ukrainians sadly have to concede a bit of land to stop this war from going on perpetually?
The answer to both those questions really are for the Ukrainians to speak to. President Zelensky gets to determine as the commander in chief if and when he's going to be willing to sit down and negotiate, and what he'll be willing to negotiate over. We're not going to dictate those terms to him. We all want to see this war end, just like the war against Hamas. This one too could end tomorrow if Mr. Putin would pull his troops out of Ukraine and end this folly of his to try to subjugate the entire country.
Though you don't see that happening anytime soon, right?
I think it's difficult to see that it's going to happen, in the very near future, given that along that front from the east to the south, both armies are kind of digging in. They've got a tough winter set of months ahead of them, and it will be more difficult for them to operate as the weather gets much colder and much worse here in coming weeks. So I don't think we can expect an end to this, in the very near future, but we all think it could end if Mr. Putin would do the right thing. As he gave this lengthy press conference a week or so ago, his end of year press conference. And he basically said for the whole world to hear, I'm not changed any of my strategic goals. Basically, Ukraine has no right to exist as an independent nation, and I have not changed any of my goals in terms of subjugating that country. And he talked about victory will be achieved. I mean, that's a pretty chilling message, and the Ukrainians, you can understand, took it very, very seriously. As today, even over the last couple of over the weekend, more drone strikes, more missile strikes on energy infrastructure in Ukraine to try to weaponize the winter that's upon the Ukrainian people. So we've got to stay with them. The counteroffensive, you're right, even they admitted it didn't go as far or as fast as they would have liked it to, but they did manage to claw back over the last couple of years, to claw back more than 50% of the territory that the Russians took in those early months of the year. They are a capable, a strong, courageous military. We've got to stay with them. And for those that, to your other point, that argue it's been $100 billion. Yes, it has been. There has been a significant amount of energy put and resources put to helping Ukraine not only defend itself, but to sustain its governing functions, not just from the United States, from other countries. Imagine what the cost in our national treasure and perhaps in American blood would be if we just walk away from this and we just let Putin have his way and he gets all of Ukraine. And now all of a sudden he's bumped up right against the eastern flank of NATO. And he has threatened NATO countries in the past. You can't just blow that off. So, I mean, the cost here could be much, much greater in terms of our own involvement in a larger war if we were to just walk away.
All right, Admiral, I have a lot more to ask you, but let's end here. Let's wrap it up. We've discussed a bit of Ukraine and Russia. We've discussed the Middle East. What national security issue keeps you up at night? What is most concerning to the U.S. government and, frankly, maybe to you personally, given your experience?
I think the president would tell you that he believes we're at an inflection point in history right now. And one of the terms of that inflection point is the assaults on democracy around the world. And you have, major democracies now. Israel, the only democracy in the Middle East. You have Ukraine, which is has gravitated to a democratic form of government here in recent years that now is under threat by Russia's Putin. And I think we should not forget that democracy. We've seen it here at home on January 6th. We've seen how fragile democracy is. That's one of the things that makes it so special. Is it what keeps it alive and vibrant is our belief in it and our ability and our willingness to defend it. And you're seeing democracy really under assault all around the world, even in the Indo-Pacific. And so I think back to the president's point, this is an inflection point. We've got to rise up to meet these challenges. We can't let the dictators and the tyrants and the autocrats win because that's a world we created this rules-based order that we've been living in since World War II. They would like to undermine it and throw it away. And I don't think that would be good for anybody. Certainly wouldn't be good for security, but it wouldn't be good for international prosperity either.
Admiral Kirby, we'll end it there. I so appreciate you joining me.
Thank you so much. I appreciate your time today.